For watching that with us. Thumbs up, thumbs down. Good conversation, Steve. We what? They don't work. Thank you for reminding me of that. We are here to learn and also to engage in a conversation. Team panel here that Ray has put together. So Ray, you will go ahead and introduce Ray as our newest Project Humanities colleague. So if you will introduce our panelists and our facilitator, then we'll move into the conversation.
Hi everyone, I'm Ray. I'm the program coordinator of the Project Humanities. I'm pretty new. I just started like 3 weeks ago. So we put together this panel today from disability advocacy groups and also from ASU faculty. To my left here, we have John Myers. Please wait, John. Thank you. He's the executive director of the Arizona Developmental Disabilities Planning Council. Since 2013, he served as the executive director of the ARC of Arizona and has previously held positions with the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society and Endowment House charities. And also he was a partner in bringing the Sprout Film Festival, which was an initiative to showcase film and video related to the field of developmental disabilities to Arizona. And then next is Dr. Switzer. She has a background in English and gender studies, and she is currently Associate Professor of Women and Gender Studies in the School of Social Transformation and co-director of the ASU Humanities Lab. She co-taught the Disrupting Disability Humanities Lab in fall of 2020, alongside the man who is next to her. She also has an ongoing research project with Anastasia Todd, University of Kentucky, that focuses on gender and invisible disability among undergraduate students who identify as women. And then to my left first is George Garcia. George is executive director of the Southwest Institute for Families and Children, supporting people with disabilities through empowerment, advocacy, and knowledge. He has a master's degree in social work, and for the past 15 years, he has worked on the state and national level, developing youth mentoring programs, facilitating self-advocacy groups, and creating technical assistance centers for self-advocacy groups. And he's been paralyzed from the shoulder down since the age of 12. He has personal experience living with a disability and navigating the challenges that they possess. Sorry, I skipped around. And then after Dr. Switzer, we have Dr. Mann. Dr. Mann is an ASU scholar of 18th century and Romantic era British literature and culture, and she co-taught the Disrupting Disability Humanities Lab in fall 2020 with Heather Switzer. And she's also the co-chair of the American Society for 18th Century Disability Caucus. And then lastly, we have Melanie Soto. She is the state director of the ARC of Arizona, a national organization that advocates for equal rights and opportunities for people with disabilities. She has 20 years of professional experience in the disability field, and she's a regional representative for the National Council of Executives, the committee for the ARC of the U.S., as well as the chair for the Verde Valley Community Practice of Transition. Thank you all for joining us here today. In our pre-meeting, we had a really fruitful discussion regarding the film. So I really look forward to the discussion that we're going to have here today. And you can take it over now. It's muted.
Better? Well, thank you very much, and thanks for the opportunity to be here tonight. I'm gonna start off by, I guess we're trying to frame the conversation and then allow these really esteemed folks to sort of guide it. But please know, as Dr. Lester said, we want this to be a conversation. It is by no means a lecture. It is intended to be an interaction between those of us who work in this field and all of you. And we really hope that you will engage with us and I guess I would say challenge us with questions and thoughts, and we'll hope to challenge you as well. I want to start because, and I want to say, you know, the work that I do primarily in the field of developmental disabilities or intellectual and developmental disabilities. The subject of the film Kelsey had a physical disability. So there is a distinction, but I want to talk about some things that are common to disability in general. And one of those, to start, is the language we use about disability. There is this thing called people first language, as opposed to disability first language or other things first language. So if I could turn it over to others in the panel, would anyone like to tackle the issue of how we talk about disability and the language we use around it, and how that, in our minds or the minds of individuals with disabilities, creates a sense of identity or the opposite? Anybody want to tackle that?
Okay, I'm gonna start. So John mentioned something called people first language. And the idea behind people first language, it really did start with people like development. The idea that you are a person first before you are your disability. So an example of sorry. So the man trying to sign this. The idea is that, so instead of saying disabled George, okay, George, wheelchair user, you can say. The idea is that one of the common refrains in the disability field is you label George, you know, people before. But with that said, they use the word cripple. And it is one of those things that is, within, you know, people with disabilities, but with spinal cord injuries, I myself have spinal cord injury. You know, it's like, you can use that term within us, but you can't. So, one of the many privileges, along with really cool parking spots. But, you know, it's something that we can use, but it's more of a cultural term also, because it is a lifestyle. You do bond with other people, especially those spinal cord injuries. There is a lot of common things we go through. But she did struggle with saying that she had a disability for several years after her.
Why does how individuals with disabilities, or why does it matter how we label ourselves, define ourselves, identify ourselves, especially if you're a person with disability? What is the impact of the words we use to define, to identify ourselves or others?
Well, I think a really good example that I've witnessed firsthand is a person with an intellectual disability being at an event and them self-identifying with the word retarded and saying to someone, well, I'm retarded, why aren't you helping us? And everyone in the room kind of gasped and was like, oh, you can't say that, you can't say that. But she understood that that was her medical diagnosis. And she could say, confident to the group, you know, I am retarded and I feel like you should be supporting us. And we had to kind of step back and say, okay, we know as a folk pop, we're not committed to use that term, but that is for right, that is for identifier. she has that privilege.
I thought it was interesting, there we go, in the film that I mean, I think the danger in those kinds of terms is that there's a human. And so I noticed in the film, there are many points in the film where she describes her body as a thing that she's detached from, and that sort of thingness. And I think that registered so differently from the crippled dance in the way in which they, take up the term to display their cultural and artistic knowledge that's so different from that kind of, which for her doing to herself for this.
Yes, I agree with everything that's been said here, and I was, Ray mentioned that I have a project with a colleague that focuses on young women and invisible disability, and one of the distinctions that we might make is, as John was talking about, the distinctions between intellectual disabilities and physical disabilities. And invisible disabilities are sort of what they found, things that aren't necessarily visible to anybody who just happens to be passing by the person. And so there's one of the things that came up in that research is because the young women in the study can quote unquote pass as normal, they had a very hard time identifying as disabled. Even though they, on a daily basis, sometimes an hourly basis, were managing conditions that impair their ability to do certain things and certainly occupied a lot of their energy and time. So they would say, well, I'm not really disabled, like I can walk. And so I think there's sort of like some cultural investments in like questions around power and privilege. For how many of us sit relative to being quote unquote normal. And I think that's one of the hard things that I gathered for Kelsey too, is she doesn't want to identify as disabled because it suggests all that she has lost. So, and all that she can't have like a normal person has. But by the end of the film, she's seeing her relationship to others, and I think maybe normality, if you will, in a different light, right? Like the whole new normal kind of concept. I don't know if that fully answers your question.
But George just delivered a lesson to me when I just said thumbs up about it. And that is precisely why we're here, because we are learning, and it immediately dawned on me because I was looking at Google into my own privilege when I'm asking thumbs up. So thank you for the lesson. I hope that is also part of what this conversation about language is. It's about the narrative that we created around this.
And I would propose that it is impossible to talk about disability without either demonstrating privilege or perhaps better, involving the notion of privilege in this conversation. And I want to touch on something that was just raised, and that is the way our society is designed. We live in a world that is designed for people who do not have disabilities. We have this sense of normal, or this sense of typical, or this sense of able-bodied. That's another bit of terminology that is often used. It is used in the film. It is not a term that is preferred through most of the disability community because it has a connotation that you are able-bodied, or you are disabled-bodied, you are not whole. But there's this term also called ableism. So can we explore a little bit about how we live in a world that's designed for people who do not have disabilities, and examples maybe that we saw in the film of ableism at work, whether conscious, unconscious, intentional, unintentional. Were there examples you saw of ableism at work?
I thought. This is not gonna be a popular opinion. The whole film was ableist. We live very complex lives. Right, and it's really difficult to show a complex life in 60 minutes or 83 minutes, however long this film is, but there are more to our lives than wanting to walk again. I got over that really quick. A lot of people that I know with disabilities, and I empathize with her pain. I know that she's going through a lot. She blamed herself for it. And it's been 10 years since her disability. My fear is that when people who don't know someone with a disability or a spinal cord injury watches this film, what they're gonna get out of it is that we live depressed lives trying to get back to what was our normal. I'm guessing her injury happened very in her 20s. And so my injury happened when I was 12. So my life revolved around basketball and tag. I sucked at both of them. So there wasn't much of a difference after that. She had a whole life of already starting to congeal. So it is a bigger pain for her. And I empathize with how much she's feeling the pain. But there is a lot more to our lives. I think about, the cure. And I remember going through the halls of St. Joseph's Hospital and seeing a poster of my doctor, Dr. Sontag, and he said the cure is 7 years away. That was 1994. And every person that I know with a disability always jokes saying, the cure is 7 years away. It's no longer an idea, it's a running joke. And whenever we see a study about like stem cells or some sort of gel or this thing that she's doing, we always think stupid lab rats are gonna walk before we go. Because it's always the studies on lab rats and stuff like that. And there's a lot more to our lives. Most people, a large percentage of people with disabilities, whether intellectual, developmental, or physical, are unemployed or underemployed. And a lot of it can be because there's discrimination, they think they can't work, or even the way the system is set up, where if you work and you make more than so much money, you lose all your health. So you choose not to work because these wheelchairs are $25,000. You need one every 5 years. So my fear, and getting back to your idea of ableism, is that my fear is what people are going to get out of this film is going to say, this is what their lives are now, and they need to get fixed so that they can fit into our world again. The whole idea behind the independent living movement, which started in the 60s, is the idea that we don't need to conform to your world needs to conform to us. We need to be inclusive of everybody, and anyway, that's just my fear about people like that.
Other thoughts?
Do you think that helping the producers of the film were consciously editing with kind of not, I don't know exactly, an awareness of that ableism and privilege that obviously was operating within? Oh,
Right. Okay, George, do you think that the producers and editors of the film were kind of selecting clips or editing with, I don't know, not the agenda of ableism, but wanting to kind of paint a very particular person, like image of what a disabled person, a person with a disability can look like, or maybe centering her experience as what it is?
No, I don't want to say that. This is her reality, this is her truth. And I empathize. This is where she's at in her life, and yeah, and there's a lot of feeling to go on. You see that in the film where her dad's still angry and blames her for this disability. That moment at the very end. I think her mom. This is her life, and I don't want to take away from it. I just don't want people to say this is indicative of everybody. And my fear is that people do believe that. So it was interesting. There was a film where God, I can't remember the name of the film, but it was a man who was disabled. He had a caregiver that sort of helped him, and it was interesting that the guy was rich. It was really rich. And I remember reading a review from a disability. They don't want to deal with the reality that most housing is not accessible. It's really difficult for people to find housing. It's really difficult to find work. It's really difficult to find a caregiver that's willing to take $12.50 an hour. So it's yeah, I don't think they were purposing. And our life is very complex. It's really difficult to show all these broader problems.
I think too, I mean, to take your point that one ableist mission is just the sense that we want cure and wholeness, that's desirable. And I think the film skewed that way because so much of it was interviews with people who had tried this medical cure. And so that was kind of dominant voice. I did think it was interesting that, in the first half of the film, all the cutouts were to a kind of dancer without a face with full bodies and move, and then halfway through the film, when she's dancing in her chair, it switches, and then she's all dancing from then on. And I noticed, I mean, like her dancing is much more powerful, and I felt much more watching her dance. And I didn't have any feelings watching the kind of cuts of. So I do think that editorial choice on the part of the filmmakers was an attempt to sort of move away from this desire for that kind of we don't even see the face. What we imagine is a kind of perfect whole body to instead her body, which is like much more evocative, I think, to watch.
Not to sound too like academic or whatever, but there are these sort of schools of thought or frameworks, if you will, for thinking about disability. If you were to take a class around disability rights or disability theory, you would run into words like the medical model and the social model. People probably heard of these ideas, and so wait, I get this right. But the basic idea is the medical model is just what it sounds. That the problem is individual, it's medical, it's all about fixing and all about healing, and tends towards pathologize, right? And does recognize the social, historical, political, economic, all of those things, but the problem is in the individual's body. And then the social model sort of a critique of medical model, right? In a way of saying,
what is disabling is the way society is organized, right? Because it's set up, like Kelsey says it, right? Like I never realized that the world was designed for people like me before this injury, and it's not designed for me, you know. So she's constantly having to figure it out. So like George mentioned the independent living movement and the, uh, one of the cool things about that movement is that people, wheelchair users, like, use sledgehammers to create curb and places where a wheelchair could go up onto a sidewalk. Because those things weren't there, right? So you have no way of like literally accessing space. At the same time, there's, I think of a writer, her name is Allison Caper. She puts out this idea of the political relational model. And she says she worries that one of the potential critiques of the social model is that it negates what impairment is like in the body, right? It like leaves your body out because the whole focus is on how the social world is disabled. And she worries that, she says in her book, she's a wheelchair user, among other things, and she says, even though everything that she's learned in the disability community is, you know, for life, and it's completely shaped the way she thinks about everything now. She doesn't actually want to get more disabled. And she worries that the social model can leave out people who do seek cure, right? And so to do seek medical intervention, so like figuring out how, I think people have to figure out for themselves how they are positioned relative to these frameworks. Recognizing that none of them seem completely capable of doing what George is saying, the complex experience of any life and anybody, right? Much less one that is facing, you know, a social world that is completely designed for us.
I think one of the interesting things that I took away from the film related to all of what we've been talking about is the parents' interactions with her, because you could see glimmers of her accepting her disability and looking forward to moving forward. But as a parent, and what parents typically do with a disabled child is they're trying to fix it, like you said, I want to fix it. And they will actually sometimes hinder the acceptance of a person with a disability, because no, you can't give them. No, you can't accept what is, because there's still that potential for so much more. Because in their mind, they felt when, you know, they were pregnant with their child that there was going to be this magnificent future and all the possibilities were endless. And then now they're faced with limits and what are the challenges going to be. And so I did see hints of that where she was on the cusp of moving forward and being at more peace. And then the parents focusing on that disability again, kind of restarting the process. And I see that a lot.
Any thoughts, any comments from those of you in attendance?
I think it was is it on?
Yes.
This is the first time I read my phone, I'm so sorry. But my question mainly to George, who suffered from the disability, and you can probably answer my question more thoroughly. What I typically notice in these films is we show the person with the disability, and then near the ending, they have an accepted state. But I realize like a lot of these films they don't demonstrate that the potential, like not the potential, the issue that disability people have, like majority of disability people can't get a job. I'm not just stereotyping, but it's the truth. Like, or it's hard for them to get educated, and I think that's what often gets left out. And I don't see any spread of like the program, or one I just I'm unaware of like how would we increase those people with disabilities, like getting to these fields that us people who I feel are privileged get to.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. I think that it's easier to show the person saying, well, woe is me, here I am, and acceptance, but when you start talking about things like employment or living on your own, or to caregiving, stuff like that, those are really complicated issues. Then you start getting into funding, you know, what is being equitable by those are really complicated issues. Really difficult to do. And they're not fun to talk about. So it's the film will there's some films that what we call inspirational. You know, it's the idea, it's like, oh, he made it at the end, you know, there was acceptance and he got married to her. And it'll make us feel something like that, but then when you start talking about other things, complicated. No, it's really difficult to address those issues. Especially when it starts getting tax knowledge.
Yeah, and if you don't mind me tagging on to that, it goes back to the point I was making before, but when you talk about disability, you can't have that conversation without there being kind of this overlay or undertone of privilege in the conversation. What we saw in the film, Gabe as well as Kelsey are two individuals who, while appearances are upper middle class white folks, in an upper middle class, generally white communities, as best we can tell. They have access to services, they have access to supports, they have access to the resources they need to help them. You know, they don't have a cure, and apparently, at least Kelsey would love to have a cure for a disability. But for all intents and purposes, she has just about everything else she needs in life in order to assist her in her journey. That is clearly not the case for vast numbers of individuals with disabilities, physical disabilities, intellectual disabilities, emotional disabilities, you name it. There are an overwhelming number of people who are reliant upon, almost entirely reliant upon state supports, federal supports, in order for them to have a decent quality of life. And so I just think it's really important that we bear in mind that what we saw on the screen, it's, you know, if you've met one person with a disability, you've met one person with a disability. These folks, Gabe and Kelsey, happen to have a fairly high quality of life, all things considered. But that's not the case for everybody, and there's so much diversity within the disability world, and so many different circumstances under which people exist.
It made me think of George's initial sort of potential claim that the film runs the risk of reinforcing ableist narrative because it focuses on an individual who comes to a certain kind of acceptance or whatever by the end of the film, and the structural or the social complexities, if you will, the structures are not made transparent. There's no discussion about where she lives and how her living is made possible. We are just left, because we don't see her go to a job, we're just left to assume that her parents something is able to make it possible for her to do what she does in the film, right? So if there's other things going on and they've chosen not to show that, like if she is going to a job or if she does have to seek out certain kinds of assistance, we're not seeing.
Yeah, and I thought, I correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think they interviewed any of the caregivers. And so, and every time they were on the screen and we got snippets of conversations. Now I can't remember the names, we're just there on twins. But that was like a conversation that I sort of wanted, or I wanted some discussion of those relationships and the potential finality of those relationships. Yeah, I was doing a head count. I was like, oh, 3 caregivers. Oh, that's amazing that she's got 3. Because in the world I work in, that's a good significant variety of people that are caring for you.
It is important though that she's one of the co-directors of that though, because
too often I'm imagining it's easier for people to try to tell somebody else's story without their input. And so, I kept looking at the gender and the ways in which the story might be different than somebody else's who did not go to dance lessons or have this wonderful life planned out ahead. And I kept thinking of this when the father said something about what happens when you plan your child's life out. And these things happen, and it's hard for me not to see that through the lens. Talk about Black Lives Matter, we talk about LGBTQ, all these things that the world's narrative have sort of given people, and we've absorbed. So that can happen on many levels, but then you amplify it through these other intersections, and you're right. Her story doesn't mean we can't connect with it, but it's really her story. But that she had input, that creative input as a co-director, I think is something that should be acknowledged as well. So she helped construct that narrative.
That is a really good thing. And a really important, because it would be easy enough to claim that, or to critique a narrative that was generated outside of her experience. So she's making some sort of, she's not.
Maybe the first point. I mean, this is where you have. I respect that.
And to that point, one thing that I did find really compelling and interesting was even though it was framed by law, there's sort of the running theme of her sexuality and the idea of desiring and being desired. She suggests that prior to her injury, like she was a very sexually active person who was interested in having sex. Not necessarily, she doesn't talk about love or partnership. She talks about essentially getting laid, and missing. And particularly with respect, to sort of gendered stories and stories that are framed by sort of ableist frameworks, because the guy gave lyrics suggest, right, he's positioned as a asexual eternal child, right? He's not a man, he's not a sexual subject. And so I thought that that part I really appreciated, and it's clearly important to her that be part of her story, that she be seen as a sexual person, sexual subject who is interested in a sexual life.
To that point, when she's interviewing the doctor says it's okay to have a healthy sense. But is there gonna be harm when it doesn't work out? When it doesn't give you the results that you're hoping? She's at one point in the movie, she says, I'm willing it. I don't know what's gonna happen, but it's gonna be the energy out there it's all gonna come back. And even though everyone she's interviewed is telling not.
Well, I mean, my note, I didn't make my note more clear to myself, but she definitely sees being human connected to being sex.
And I thought it was interesting that there's so much in the film about feeling, she wants us to feel, but it's like a deeply feeling movie about, I thought it was sort of secondarily about the grief over her father. That's actually that, and the kind of like, I think to George's point, there's a sort of fixation on a certain kind of physical feeling, even while the film itself is demonstrating the huge emotion, right? And so, like, what it actually demonstrates is the continuity of feeling in what she claims is now a sort of absence.
I mean, I was just thinking the whole time, her love language is definitely touch.
Yeah, right. That's her.
And I feel like that's her biggest grieving point, is losing touch.
Well, I mean,
She does mention something that I could identify with. The chair is a barrier between, not just the person with a disability in society, but between individuals. I mean, think about it. Even when you're having a conversation with somebody, you're really into that conversation, you really want to talk to somebody, you lean forward. You get closer. You go to restaurants, you see people, they're always at this angle when they're meeting together. I can't get at that. There's many times where I just nod my head and just go, I cannot do what you're saying. Because you can't move forward. So there is this barrier, there is a wall between people with disabilities that it's really difficult for them. But it's true, there is this idea that you can't connect as well as you used to before with people.
So there was another point that was made, and we had this conversation, as we were setting up for this about empathy. George, you've mentioned that word empathy a few times tonight about the empathetic story. And I'm remembering the moment where where Kelsey asked, well, what would you do if you were in my place? And I thought his response was very interesting as we try to sort of not necessarily understand Kelsey's story, but to be more empathetic or to be empathetic. When he responded something to the effect of, I don't know if I can put myself in your place. Because we keep thinking that it's such an easy thing to do. It's just imagine that you couldn't do this and this and this, but to say that approach to empathy is really impossible. And if you're imagining it, then it's not real. So then rather than saying, well, if I were you, well, the reality is that you're not me. So the question that she asked was really an impossible question for him to ask. And that to me is an understanding that we at the project are trying to work on as we put together something to sort of challenge this notion of what does empathy mean. You don't have to be Kelsey in order to connect with her story. And so that to me was one of the moments that stood out and became more relevant than others may have picked out because we got stuff going on around empathy right now.
It also, I mean, it's the opposite of the moment with the father, where he says to her, like, I can't be happy unless you're happy. Like, if you're, I mean, I understand as a parent, but that the guilt and the pressure for her to perform happiness to control his feelings is, those moments.
I'd like to return to that. Sorry, go ahead.
On a lot of people.
I just had a question, like, because I regularly don't have anybody with a physical or mental disability, and I feel like there might be a lot of like ignorant things I do that like can contribute to like not being, I guess, sympathetic to like that community. Because I remember one time my cousin told me about this one time she's like entering a building and like a guy just kicked like the sign like for like the door to open, and she got so mad because she was like, well, like people need that sign to like put their hand, so they could open it instead of like, having a shoe on it that's been like walking around. And I like never thought about that. So I just kind of wanted to ask like about, mental like disability or even physical, like what are things that able people do that, like every day that can really affect people with these disabilities.
Just be a friend. Everyone's different, everybody's gonna have different needs, but everybody needs a friend. So,
Yeah, I would say if you're showing, and this is a very simplistic answer, but if you're showing respect to everyone around you, you're unlikely to offend or in some way disadvantage somebody who has a disability. Just as a general rule, if we get all the golden rule to us, we would go a long way. But I think that one was up there after that.
So I think it's important to take a moment when you're observing others and not immediately jump to a negative conclusion about why they're doing something or if they need something. Because you don't know the full backstory, especially if there's an invisible disability. I mean, that's the hardest to understand why someone's doing what they're doing in that moment in response to their environment. And so if you take a moment and you just really observe, and then you ask. You ask if they need help or if they need assistance. And sometimes, we're all stubborn and we'll say no, you don't need help or you don't need assistance, and just hang back a little bit. I mean, it's that being respectful type of situation. In the world of autism, it is giving those moments for someone to process what's going on around them, and allowing them to come to their own conclusions of how they need to handle the situation. Because I've seen where people just want to jump in and they want to help so badly because it's going to fast track where you were going or what you were doing. And it's just a level of patience that you just have to practice.
And I'm by no means saying that you're wrong when you say that you don't know anybody who has a disability. But I think you might be surprised because there are so many people in our communities who have hidden disabilities. Kelsey, we know what her disability is. Apologize, George, we know you have a disability. And other folks, it may be evident, but for a great many people, they have disabilities that we can't see on the outside, and we interact with them every single day.
I want to add on that, so there's a concept in disability called universal design. So a lot of times, open up accessibility is not only designed for people with disabilities. Also, sometimes it is not for people with long-term disabilities, but temporary disabilities also exist. So a lot of time, like, for example, there was one time I was like moving a lot of stuff in my hand, and both of my hands are like occupied. But like having that door accessible to me, I can use my knee to open the door for me so I can go through. That is also like a way of thinking universal design, like how having accessibility, like in the spaces, can help you as an able-bodied person. Right, so it does not need to, people with disabilities, of course, important in these conversations and should be like put at the center of it, but also for like people like to really function in the society. It is not really considered as a way it is designed, because like we all have moments that we need those accessibilities.
Yeah, the biggest beneficiary, the ones that have benefited the most from curb cuts has actually been people with strollers. Yeah. Just have it. If you're the wheel down the town, throwing them off the curb. But yeah, it's universal design.
And another thing that I would just throw out there, which we talked about in our class, it sounds almost silly, but like just phrases like that's crazy. Like that crazy is a bad thing, right? You could also say that is a bad thing, or this is a bad situation. But what you say is this is a crazy situation. And so these things are just these phrases are like in our language in the way that we think, but we don't necessarily see sort of the ableist implications of simple phrases like that. So I think bringing the respect that John and George are talking about to sort of a level of awareness that you just may not have any idea, that you're sort of reinforcing a notion that's not really positive for people who may identify as like crazy, but don't think of themselves as bad people.
I think that there's also like one other element that I've heard that was like really helpful for me from like a friend who is like physically disabled, and that is like respect is in like talking to somebody like as if they're a person and human. So let's say for example you see somebody who's like struggling to get like up or ramp, or there's something that's inaccessible and they're like
trying to navigate it, just simply going up to somebody and saying like, hi, my name is Rachel, and do you need help? Rather than just coming up from behind and being like, oh my God, do you need help? It's like starting an actual conversation with a person the way you would want someone to start a conversation with you, is really big. And then the other thing that I think like is a gold nugget of knowledge that I've been told is like accessibility like helps everybody because our health is temporary. Like every single person's health is temporary. So like we're investing in ourselves when we invest in making a more accessible world because we'll need it at some point.
Certainly not in accessibility, not being the second thought. Like, oh, we designed this building, but having that, the notion of universal design, thinking about access instead of accommodation, right? Because access, accommodations are designed for people who, in the concept of accommodation, who need this special thing in order to be like others, as opposed to creating an accessible space, place, syllabus, whatever the thing.
Well, I was just thinking too, I mean, I just think thinking about access and barriers to access often produces cooperation. So one of the things we did in our class was have students go through their week and write down where they had easy access and where they had blocked. And our students, or range of students who did identify as having physical or cognitive disabilities and students who did not. And for students who say, I don't identify as having a disability, but I don't have an easy way to get to campus, or I don't have a computer, I don't have there's a kind of, then you're starting to think about economic considerations, which impact varieties of people and then can create coalitions around producing access for everyone, so that everyone is able to access classroom space, everyone is able to, right? I think that helpful.
So, being a future construction person, I would like to ask, like, what could be change in the new construction buildings, or what would you like to see for the prospective ableism building?
Anything that whether it's physical access or access for people who have visual disabilities or deaf or people who are autistic. Anything that reduces barriers. So it's just a matter of figuring out what those barriers are and how can we maximize the access to everything. And that's very big.
No shade to the Americans with Disability Act, because that was an enormous accomplishment. And was, wrought also right through enormous struggle. But in our class at, the ADA compliance officer at ASU, last name is Fisher. Peter, I'm sorry. So Peter's a great guy. Anyway, he's also a wheelchair user, and our students were working on a project with Peter, and they were shocked to learn that an 8-inch step is ADA compliant. And they were like, Peter, what happens if you go over an 8-inch step? He's like, oh, I'm racking for sure. But he was like, this is within the law. So you can, and to your question, I don't think you can just be like, oh, we have ADA handled, we have compliance handled, right, at that kind of level. Need to be thinking, sort of more capaciously and openly about how all kinds of bodies and minds can have access.
Which means having all kinds of bodies and minds in the construction.
I think
You have
in the room.
right, like you have to use that. I mean, sometimes you don't even realize that something
isn't accessible until you are experiencing. it, Right? And I mean, a few years back, I'm in Parker, which if any of you guys have been in Parker, Arizona, it's just this little itty bitty thing off the road. And staying at a hotel, and it had a lift for the pool and the jacuzzi. And I was just sitting there like, oh my gosh, this is so fantastic. And I'm going on and on about it to all my friends, and one of my friends was like, yeah, I think it's ridiculous that all the hotels have to do this. I was like, oh, now you've got me on my soapbox. And, but it's like acts of legislation to make that happen. That's not just something that hotels are deciding to do. It's an acts of legislation, and it's unfortunate that that is what needs to happen. For us to be mindful of not only what makes it easier for the person with the disability, but the caregivers around them when they want to facilitate something for someone to be able to participate in it just the way that they are. And not have it be an extremely physically taxing thing for themselves. I mean, you think about the act of assisting someone like Kelsey into a pool. That's not probably that difficult. Now think the reverse, getting out of the pool with someone who is wet, slippery, now you are as well. I mean, you're setting yourselves up for injuries and things like that. So, I mean, when I see those types of things happening in construction, I get really excited because I know that it's just helping everyone.
I'll share a story of what happened to me, and the idea that you have to think about people with disabilities in all areas of the building design. It was my first day of graduate school for my MSW. And the MSW program, when I first started, with the ASU West campus. And so first day, I'm on the second floor. It's class started at 5 p.m. And I don't know anybody there except for my assistant who was there with me for school, and my friend who is also a wheelchair user. And we're sitting there in class, about to begin, with a fire alarm goes. And at first, everybody freezes. They're like, and so I just sort of pile up, never quiet. I said, I think we should leave. And then everybody unfreezes, like they're the headlights. And they start marching up. And if anybody's ever been on a second floor building, or second floor on up, elevators don't work. They open up so that you can't get in them. And so I'm on the second floor, the fire alarm's going off, and my friend says to me, what do we do? And I said, did you bring marshmallows? We're screwed. And everybody started filing out of the building. And then all of a sudden, some of my classmates, who I at that moment had never met in my life, and still have. But when we started the first day, they stopped and they go, what do you guys do? And I said, I guess we wait, because I don't know what to do. And so they said, well, we're gonna sit back and we're gonna drag you down the stairs. We'll drag you down. And that's what I fell in love with. And so ASU didn't have a plan, and luckily that was just a test. So I contacted I emailed them, and I said, hey, this is what happened to me. And they, he emailed me back with a generic handbook from ASU that had nothing to do with people with disabilities in the environment. So I said, oh. So I told some friends of mine, and they said, well, we're gonna call the kids. And then Channel 5 got on it, and they did a story about how ASU is not acceptable for people with disabilities in cases of emergency. And then I got a real email back from my group. And then he said, well, we're gonna look into it. And then they said, you should have contacted the news. You ignored me, so that's what it is. So the ASU started to rewrite that on what to do with people with disabilities. They also put up signs on each floor, there's not a most, the second floor, on areas of refuge for people with disabilities, because there was no sign anywhere. And we started really thinking about what to do with people with disabilities. And a professor of mine said, that because I spoke up, now they're getting, he got right now. What to do with people to help somebody who got. But it was because they didn't think about what to do. Get something records for people with disabilities, it could have been a real problem and that would be a fire.
I think the other thing too is we need to surround ourselves with people who will call us out when we step into a little pile of food, and then ask for forgiveness. We do that in our office. We did it this week, making a comment about, oh, you're not doing something fast enough. And that can be one of those ways in which that's ableist. The ways in which we set up this room had to do with ableist, in terms of people who may be immunocompromised. So there are all kinds of everyday ways that don't have to be life altering in the sense it could be life altering for the people who are on the receiving end, but it doesn't have to be like a magic wand and then trying to fix things. But I'm not gonna forget the thumbs up tonight, because that was a lesson learned, it wasn't coded. So I appreciate being surrounded by people who will say, you may want to think about that when you say that. So there has to be another way you can say that. Ableist language is better. And I feel like I'm on a crusade trying to ask people to think about it, but also to self-reflect, which is why those humanity 101 principles that we have not mentioned tonight are central to this conversation. Because the humanity 101 principles are not about faith-based. We can often say this is about religion or some other faith. This is about our faith in humanity. And when we talk about compassion and empathy, we already talked about that tonight. I'm asking for forgiveness for stepping into the poop, clean it up, and then keep walking. Integrity, kindness, respect, and self-reflection. All of those have come up, at least for me, in this conversation tonight. And that we hope that people see this in the context of justice and diversity and belonging and all of those kinds of things. So, we invite you also to take the pledge. We've got magnets out there, put it on the refrigerator if you have a refrigerator to be reminded of these. But we want to sort of give our panelists and facilitators the sort of last word on what is it you will take away from this event? Not what is it that we want other people to take away, but what is it that you will take from this event?
I think what I came away with is this strong sense of how impoverished my experience of visual art is when it's just able bodied. And I think that I found it.
I'm not ready to order.
No, it's good to have this conversation. It's good to have any conversation, whether it's a good film or a bad film, or as long as we get together and acknowledge that there are these things that are going on.
Put you on the spot. If there's nothing you're taking away, then that's fine. We expect that.
Part of me wants to say that I was prepared to be very full of the film. And I do think that they're be made and some of them have been made. But I also didn't expect to be quite so moved. And I forgot the dancing makes me cry. I don't know why, it just always does. And so I think there's something valuable. I think I'm just reminded of how it's easy to be critical, and there are certainly archetypes that need to be weighed, but also how do we sort of take what the film might be trying to tell us that's not available to critique, like feel. I appreciate that. I thought it did be.
I think it just reminded me, I love the point of Kelsey being a co-director of her own story. and, participating with John with the Sprout Film Festival for many years. I can't walk away from watching a film that is either starring or directed or written by a person with a disability and not feel that extra little gut punch than if I was to go to the movie theater and see something that's been glamorized and dramatized to the point where you just don't even know, even if it's based on a true story, how much of that was real. And so I appreciate the opportunity that these kind of films are being made and that they're being shown to the public.
I have to echo what Melanie said, because through this film festival, we were able to see just a wide variety of different kinds of films about and featuring individuals with disabilities. And Kelsey talked a lot in the movie about healing, about wanting to be whole again. But in the end, she said that the more I accept this, the more I feel free. So that acceptance brought her that sense of freedom. Her art, instead of being her life, it became her therapy. And in a larger sense, films about people with disabilities are an art form, and they are therapeutic. And this is probably too grandiose a statement, but at least in the world of intellectual developmental disabilities, where people are so marginalized so much of the time and often disrespected so much of the time, to see them featured and to see them portrayed, to hear their stories in documentaries, but also to see them as actors in narratives or creating cartoons or music videos or whatever, it's so inspiring and it's so affirming. And so I just love the fact that we're seeing films about and featuring people with disabilities of whatever sort. And it's just so uplifting. And I would also say the fact that so many of you are here tonight and so many of you want to engage in a conversation about this is also very uplifting. And that we're all this very one another. That's so fantastic.
Well, that's what we do and have been doing. And we thank you for joining us tonight. Please, round of applause for our panel. It's really great. One of the humanities, like I said earlier, we've been doing this for 10+ years. It's our 10th anniversary last year. We've given our panelists also the feedback form. And we will continue these in the spring. We do anywhere from 8 to 12 conversations about the spectrum of things. In the disability world, I know we've at least had one called Autism and Love, and it was about those with autism and their romantic aspirations and lives. So I think what we're trying to do is learn. We never have a program for which we have all the answers. In fact, we're here to learn, just like we hope that you are here to learn and to teach. So we thank you all. Thank Ray, our newest staff member. Ray has already taught us a lot of stuff. And it really made us more conscious of how we need to be inclusive. There are certain ways that we can talk about certain kinds of inclusion, but there are ways in which we may not be able to see the wholeness of that world of belonging. So I hope it's the conversation that you'll continue to join us. Project Humanities has all kinds of social media connections. We bring people together to do 3 things: to engage in talking, listening, and the potential for connecting. TLC. So please look us on Facebook. We have a homeless outreach where our language has changed from homeless people to people experiencing homelessness, so that the homelessness is not an identity, but a circumstance in that regard. And so I love the fact that you start with language, because we do language. Language is the skin of our thoughts. So thank you again. Have more snacks. And we do have a couple of raffle things to give you. So where's our little raffle? Do we have any more to put in here? Are they all in here? All right, so I'm going to pull one. Just come over and choose a book of your liking. Number of this, the last 4 digits, the last 3 digits, 372. Your number, the last 372. The panelists get numbers also. 372. Nobody has 372? Come on down. Come on over. We got one. And you are 10. Yeah, all right, 10. Come over, pick out one. And these are books related to the program that we have. So feel free to choose the one of your liking. Maybe the 10. The other is 375. 375, come on over. If you got one. Again, they're related to projects that we, programs that we've done. What about 365? 365, all right, you got one. And I'll say that these everyday ways that we can be more aware of this, you know how when people get microphones, they'll say things, oh, I have a big voice, I don't need a microphone. And we learn from some of our audience members, whenever you have an opportunity to have a microphone, everybody should use the microphone. Because you don't want somebody to say, I can't hear, or I've had a loss of hearing or hearing loss or something, but just use it if it's available. Don't assume just because you have a big voice that people may not need it. So thank you again for coming, and let me give one more. What about 366? You want to come over and get one? All right. Thank you again, and remember Project Humanities, talking, listening, connecting. Good night.